Today, I'm going to be talking about ethics, which is probably not one of the most exciting topics in the world, but I'm hoping at the end of our little chat that some of you might remember some of the things, and perhaps someday it might help you out. So first of all, I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself so you can kind of understand where I'm coming from. Again, my name is Larry Israel. I'm a 43-year member of the Chicago Board of Trade. I started my career right out of college. I worked for a grain company. I was a grain merchandiser, and my job was to hedge the positions of the grain company. So I learned the practical elements of the industry. I spent then a couple of years working for a major brokerage firm, and then I had the opportunity to trade. That was really my ultimate goal. All I could think about when I was your age, or most of your ages, was I wanted to be in the pit. I wanted to be in the pit really, really bad. So the Chicago Board of Trade had expanded their membership. They had created some junior classes of membership. I got an associate membership, which allowed me to trade a futures contract called Treasury bonds. At the time, no one really had ever heard of them, but it became the world's largest contract after about 15 years. So I traded actively for myself. I also did some significant brokerage. And I did that up until about the mid-1990s, and then decided to recreate myself and do something different. Well, as I think Katie was mentioning, in 1989, I believe that was the year, there was an FBI sting at both the Chicago Board of Trade and the Chicago Mercantile, where some trading infractions were uncovered. They turned out to be federal crimes. Most members didn't realize that violating an exchange rule could also be considered a potential criminal offense, and people did find that out. But one thing that the government did do was they slapped on an ethics training requirement in 1993. So everybody that's registered in the industry now has to participate in ethics training, which really is more of a market conduct type of training. So when I decided to reinvent myself, I created a company called Exchange Analytics, and today we provide we work with about 80% of all the derivatives participants, derivative companies that participate in the industry, and we do a lot more than just ethics training. We'll do cybersecurity, AML, customer protection, market conduct, that type of thing. What is ethics anyway? Well, most people learn this in school, but ethics is basically the moral principle that governs a person's behavior or the conduct of of an activity. Most people won't disagree with me. If something is illegal, it's obviously unethical. However, what I found interesting when I started trading was sometimes when things are legal, they may not be ethical. And I'm going to go into that in just a little bit. What I'm trying to say is that there's gray areas at times. Some of my favorite quotes about ethics. Potter Stewart, who was a Supreme Court justice, said, "Ethics is knowing the difference between what you have a right to do and what is right to do," which I thought was kind of profound. Samuel Richardson, who was a British author, I think from about 250 years ago, said, "Calamity is a test of integrity." And my favorite quote is Albert Einstein's. He said, "Relativity applies to physics, but not to ethics." So let me give you some quick examples of ethical dilemmas. When I was in the pit, this is a personal example, when I was in the pit, there were occasions where I was given orders to execute that I questioned. I didn't know what the motivation for the trades were. It could have been potential money pass. It could have been a potential wash trade. It could be a simple clerical mistake. Sometimes I had a chance to investigate, but almost always I didn't have the time to investigate. In the futures industry, markets can move very quickly, as I'm sure most of you are aware. And not only can the markets move quickly, but because you're operating on a huge amount of leverage, it could be a tremendous amount of financial value that is gained or lost in a very short amount of time. So it's important to act quickly and make a decision. In most cases, I felt I was obligated to fill the order, but if I questioned it, then to later either investigate it or report it to the appropriate authorities. Here's another hypothetical example. Let's say you're handling a customer account, and in the securities industry, there's a concept called suitability, and that means that whether a certain product that's being traded is suitable for that investor. In the futures industry, we go on a customer basis. So in the futures industry, if a customer has been provided with all the required risk disclosure, he or she is generally presumed to have made an informed decision to accept the inherent risks associated with that futures trading. So in other words, you don't distinguish between treasury bond futures, soybean futures, or oat futures. It's all highly leveraged, high risk type of transactions. So let's say you're in the futures industry and you have a customer who you've provided adequate risk disclosure. They've signed off on the risk disclosure, and just prior to a major economic report that's coming out that could cause huge price movements, you receive an order from that customer that is very large relative to the customer's account size, and you're questioning whether or not the customer fully understands the risk. What should you do? Well, while it might be totally legal to accept and execute the order as given, it might be unethical to do so without warning the customers of the risk involved, even though they've signed off on the risk disclosure. Violating rules and regulations of an exchange is clearly wrong and potentially considered illegal or even criminal because exchanges are overseen by the federal government. One thing to keep in mind is what's legal and ethical can change over time. We've seen dramatic changes during the course of my career. Let me give you a few examples. Non-competitive trading. When I first started trading, the rule, it was like it was the 11th commandment, was everything that ever traded had to be done competitively. There was only two exceptions. One exception was exchange for related positions, which always involved a cash grain underlying position and an exchange of futures so that two parties could immediately hedge their positions. And the second time was rare, but in certain markets it was allowed to cross trades provided you followed certain very specific rules regarding cross trades. Nowadays, that has been expanded to non-competitive trading has expanded, so we now are allowed to conduct block trades, which are large transactions or transactions that meet certain thresholds that are privately negotiated transactions. Another thing that's changed, it was specifically prohibited to have pre-execution communication between two parties before a trade was commenced. Now, pre-execution communication is allowed in most contracts. And finally, spoofing. When I started out, I wouldn't know what the term spoofing meant. In fact, up until about 20 years ago, I had no idea what spoofing meant. In the pit, when it was human to human, people were making markets all the time, myself included. Constantly bidding and offering. Spoofing is basically bluffing. Spoofing is showing size and entering orders without the intent to actually execute the trade, but to represent to the market that there's strong buying or selling interest. In the pit, there was no audit trail, so no one could discern what the intent of a trader was. But today, we have almost a perfect audit trail since everything is most trades now are electronic. You can see all activity within microseconds, and you can discern by looking at patterns what the probable intent of a trader was. So spoofing is potentially a very serious criminal offense. Now, I have 2 minutes, so what I wanted to do in my final 2 minutes is trying to prepare you to what to do if you encounter an ethical dilemma. One thing I feel very confident about is that for those of you that do work in the derivatives industry and are involved with transactions, you will most likely encounter at least an ethical dilemma in your career, a tough one. Realize that ethical dilemmas will occur. Markets can move very quickly, and again, because of leverage, there could be major financial consequences. The second thing is be prepared for those ethical dilemmas by understanding the laws, the rules, and the regulations that you're operating under. This is where, I come in with the training component. Training is an effective way of making sure that you understand the rules and regulations. And most of you here, I see a lot of young faces. At some point in your career, you're probably going to have employees that you're going to supervise. It's just as important to have your employees partake in training so they understand. There's 5 rules that I've tried to live by in my career when an ethical dilemma occurs. Number 1 is to report or question immediately something that doesn't seem right or appear right to an appropriate supervisor or authority. Number 2 is to seek guidance as soon as possible. As I said, many ethical dilemmas, you don't know all the facts involved in the dilemma until afterwards. But even if you make a decision, follow up by seeking guidance. The third thing, and this is really crucial, always act in the best interests of the customer, of your customer, and the marketplace. That's in the Commodity Exchange Act, but it's a good rule to live by. And the fourth thing is trust your gut. What does your gut tell you? If it feels wrong, I know you've heard it a million times, if it feels wrong, it probably is. And finally, consider what your mom or dad or significant other would say if they read about your decision the next day in the paper. This is a very exciting industry. For those of you that are going to enter it, I'm very excited for you. I wish you a lot of luck, and thank you, John, so much, and thank you very much for your attendance today.
We read dozens of news sources, so you only have to read one. John Lothian News.